Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Arelis Hernández, reporter for the Washington Post. Joining me today is Eduardo Díaz, director of the Smithsonian Latino Center, and he's also the interim director of the forthcoming planned National Museum of the American Latino. Welcome, Señor Díaz.
Thank you very much, Arelis. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Well, let's jump right in. I wanted to start, it being Hispanic Heritage Month, I wanted to start with some of your personal reflections. What parts of your heritage are you most proud of, and what do you wish people had more awareness about in terms of that heritage?
I'm a product of the Chicano movement. So when I entered college in 1968 at San Diego State, it was at the apex, right? The Chicano movement. And at that time, there was a real strong motivation to get connected with indigenous roots versus necessarily Spanish roots. And so that sort of started me on this long process of self-discovery. You know, I knew that I was an indigenous person. I knew I had indigenous blood, but I always saw indigeneity through a Latino lens versus an indigenous lens. And so, you know, Ancestry.com, I did it, and lo and behold, 50% Mexican indigenous, and based on where my people are from, I'm probably Chichimeca. There was a large Indian nation called La Gran Chichimeca in that part of Mexico. And so I suppose that's what it is, and I've been now more interested in learning more. And actually, upon retirement, which is not too far away from now, I plan on learning Nahuatl, which is or at least basic Nahuatl, which is the language of the Aztecs and also the Chichimeca and those folks that live there. And it's still very much spoken now. So I'm going to do the best I can to learn what I can in the time that I have available before I enter the world of Mictlan, which is the inframundo, the world of the afterlife of the Nahuatl-speaking cultures. It's not exactly, you know, your typical retirement plan, but you know, I have always wanted to learn more about that indigenous past, which predominates right within me, and so it's a lifelong pursuit, you might say.
Well, as you reflect on your own story, right? I wonder if we can pivot towards, you know, our stories, right? And what do you think is most important to understand about the histories of indigeneity and colonialism that runs through the Americas?
I think it's critically important. It's you know, it's not like when the Europeans first came to the American continent that this was sort of an empty space. No, it was well inhabited, very advanced civilizations, lots of people, you know, and you know, something happened, and you know, we can go into a lot of interesting details of the invasion and the conquest and the colonial period. But you know, we were here. Indigenous people have been here since the millennium. And so I do think it's important to go back and always remember that that is the case. And even though there has been a lot of destruction, a lot of death, the erasure of cultures, erasure of histories, erasure of languages, that I think it's always important to go back now more than ever. You know, the past shapes the present and helps us envision the future. You know, we're taking on an interesting project here at the Smithsonian entitled The Other Slavery, which really looks at so what I will call the charter generation of racialized enslavement practices here in what is now known as the United States. This is a historical chapter that's not been looked at much, because when we think of slavery, we think of a black-white, you know, narrative, right? But indigenous slavery or Indian slavery, Indian bondage, predates African slavery, and we've not taken, I think, a hard enough look at it. So we're putting together a program that actually starts on September the 24th, and we're going to take an in-depth look at this particular history. And I raise it because we're talking about indigenous people who were the victims of enslavement practices.
Well, yeah, so this is an upcoming virtual symposium, if I'm correct, right? And just for our audience, it's called The Other Slavery. Well, in talking about these issues, you know, what do you want people to take away from these sessions, this symposium, about the legacy of colorism in, you know, the broader Latino community?
Sure. You know, it's interesting. It's a very interesting question. You know, the issue of colorism, of course, has come up, and there's a direct link to slavery, obviously. I was thinking, when all the uproar occurred with the movie Washington Heights, right, when people were criticizing the film for not putting or placing Afro-Latinas and Afro-Latinos in principal roles within the film, or enough of them, it did raise this issue. And we have to understand that during the colonial period in Mexico and other parts of Latin America, the Spanish may have been the first to impose a system of what we now recognize as racial profiling. And, it was a caste system, sistema de castas. It was a caste system where, lighter skinned people were at the top of the pyramid and people that were darker skinned were at the bottom or inhabited the lower rungs. Understand that the Spaniards had a real urge to get a grip on this dynamic demographic explosion that their invasion and that their colonialism unleashed in the Americas. Spaniards, coupled with native people, mestizo, me, right? For example, Spaniards coupled with African slaves, mulattoes, right? Asian slaves were brought in because, let's remember, the Spaniards went and established a colony in the Philippines, which was a major slaving port that the Portuguese were also very involved with. And those folks came over, slaves came over from Asia to Mexico. So all of that melange, all of that mixing took place because mestizos were then marrying mulattoes and their offspring were married. And just, you know what I mean? And the Spaniards were very much intent on maintaining social, political, and economic order that benefited the colonial state. And so that led to a diminishment in the importance and the appreciation of the cultures of people of color. And we see this today, where, for example, if you wanted to do better, you wanted to mate with somebody that was lighter skinned than you because you wanted to mejorar la raza, right? You wanted to better the race, right? You didn't want to marry below you because that would doom things. That would doom your future and that of your children. So we still have that concept of mejorar la raza still sort of circulating within our communities. Pelo malo is another example. Bad hair. Bad hair refers to the hair of African descended peoples, right? That's not the kind of hair you want. You want straight hair, right? And there are Spanish language versions of the N-word, and very disparaging terms that we use for people, those of indigenous physiognomics, right? Those the way people assess character based on outward appearances only. So that still, I'm sad to say, is a legacy that still lives on with our community. But I'm also happy to say, on the other hand, that the Latino Center and the National Museum of the American Latino will examine this history of colorism. In fact, we're about to begin a project which is going to be, I think, very thorough and very painful. But I think we have to do this now. We cannot sit back, especially in the times that we're living in, to not address this issue of colorism within our community, because it's real, it's historic, it's lasting, and it's present. And, we have to deal with it, period.
No, I totally relate. My family is of Puerto Rican heritage. My parents are from the island themselves, and phrases like mejorar la raza and pelo malo were something that I heard throughout my childhood. And I'm a millennial, right?
Yeah, no, es una tusa, right? That's another disparaging word for somebody of African descent in Puerto Rico. So it's insidious, right? And there's roots to that. And I think and the casta system, in my view, is one of those roots that we need to look at very carefully in the way in which those racial constructs occurred within our communities.
Well, and speaking, of these legacies that we've inherited through colonialism, I want to shift a little bit to U.S., right, and the history or the notion, I should say, of manifest destiny underpinning the U.S.-Mexico War. I mean, I live in San Antonio, a city that you're very familiar with, and here a few months ago, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas stopped a talk at a museum about a book called Forget the Alamo, in which the authors were going to speak, and it's a book that talks about sort of the mythology around the Alamo, but also about the impact that mythology had on Mexican Americans here in Texas and the way that they viewed themselves. So my question to you is, in terms of the notion or the enduring impact of, the notion of manifest destiny, how has that shaped, do you think, the boundaries of our country and our idea of Latinidad?
Well, the notion of manifest destiny is a white supremacist notion, right? It's the notion that God gave white folks, the right to explore these territories, right, and to dominate the people who lived in those territories, primarily in this particular case, Mexicans and indigenous peoples. And so it was a very dangerous doctrine, but nonetheless, obviously enacted in a warlike manner, leading to, as you said, the Mexican-American War, which occurred between 1826 and 1846 and 1848, primarily. And so you have this notion of people also wanting to establish Texas as a slave state. So here again, the narrative of slavery enters into the conversation, right? The South wanted to expand its territory, right? And, so Texas became sort of a plum, if you will, in that sort of goal. And, there's these lasting notions of the Black legend, the Spanish Black legends that, Mexican people were mongrels. We were somehow, again, inferior, not human enough, incapable of self-government. I mean, if you read some of the Senate testimony, right after the end of the Mexican-American War, and efforts to incorporate, let's say, New Mexico, for example, or Texas, New Mexico in particular, as a state, oh my God, some of the Senate testimony is brutal. I mean, it is ugly. I mean, words like mongrel and just in all kinds of references to our inferiority status as Mexican people, as a mixed race. Let's be real. Let's be honest about what that was all about. It was about territorial expansion, right? And it was about a supremacist view of who should, live in this country, and who should, after the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in April of 1848, nearly half of Mexico became the United States. All those thousands of Mexicans, with a stroke of a pen, all of a sudden became U.S. citizens, but they spoke no English, right? They didn't know much about the United States. And then, well, the history is long, and we can talk about that's a subject for a whole other
No. I
conversation.
mean, I can tell that you and I can talk about this for hours. I'm a huge
Sure.
U.S. Latino history,
Sure.
just nerd. My first classes in college just transformed my life. But I'm going to try to bring it to the now, right? Of what we can learn and what we can draw from these
Sure.
chapters of in history. Well, how do we make sense, right? I just came from the border in Del Rio, reporting on this situation with migration. But how do these chapters in history help us make sense of the present times in which we're living, and sort of some of the continued anti-immigrant sentiment that we see in American political discourse?
Right. I think it's still this notion that people of color in this country often they're still othered. We're the other, right? Like sometimes you may have experienced this yourself. Puerto Ricans experience it a lot. Maybe their Spanish, their English is accented, and they will say, "Well, where are you really from?" No, well, I'm a U.S. citizen. I know, but where are you really from, right? And so it's still this sort of othering of our community that occurs. And so at the border, there was a line drawn after the war, and where there was no line before, because there was such fluidity, as you know, before the war, and even after the war up to a certain period, and then things got militarized. If you go to El Paso or Del Rio or any of the places that you've visited, at least you'll know how militarized, in fact, it really is. And so it's still this notion of people coming across the border, or trying to come across the border, and still yet viewing them as the other and not desirable, not deserving of being in this country. That kind of attitude shapes immigration policy, unfortunately, and also the enforcement of those laws and those policies. And we see it even today, right? What's going on with the Haitian immigrants, primarily in the Del Rio area in particular, Del Rio, Ciudad Acuña. So it's painful. It's painful to see, but I think it's just the legacy of that history of division and the history of othering and the I don't know, not wanting quote unquote undesirable peoples to come and benefit from living in this country, or this notion that somehow these people are deficits, right, to the country. They don't add anything. They're not prepared to add to the economy. They're not prepared to add to social betterment or cultural dynamism. Quite the contrary, and we know that.
Well, and on this issue of otherizing, right? We know now, or at least we knew, and it's been confirmed by the census that Latinos increased by leaps and bounds in terms of number here in the country, but not because of immigration, because most Latinos in this country now, or large majority, are native born, like me and you.
Right.
I mean, how do we sort of move away from Latino growth as being just a story of immigration to one that's a part of the official canon of this country?
I don't know. I just think we need to keep on reminding people that what 60. I haven't seen the latest Pew Research statistics, but the last time I looked, it was 65% of Latinas and Latinos are native born, as you say. 35% are immigrants. So and it's funny every time you say Latino, to some people, immediately the word immigrant comes up right after, right? You must be an immigrant, and that's not really the case at all. We have been here in this country before there was even this country, right? We have made significant, monumental contributions to nation building and shaping national culture over so many years. We're here now, and as you noted, we're one of the fastest growing population segments in the country, and we continue to add to the economy, to social betterment, to cultural dynamism, and so forth. And we're going to be here for a long time to come and in greater numbers. So I think it's really important for people, who are, and that's part of the reason we're doing the museum, and part of the reason we're opening the gallery, the Molina Family Latino Gallery, American History, is to sort of share these stories and share with the general visitor of the museums a little bit about who we are, how long we've been here, what we've done, what we've brought to this country, and what we are prepared to continue to give back to this country, and how we are preparing ourselves to share even more about with who we are, and continue to bring a lot to the table. So I don't know. It's just it's like a continuing effort. It's nonstop. We have to continue to help people understand the true nature of who we are as a people, and I should say peoples, because we're a very diverse group of people, as you well know. You're Puerto Rican, I'm Chicano. We have so many countries of origin. We have so many communities of residence throughout this land, and we need to understand that, hey, you may be sitting next to a Latino right now and don't know it. Maybe you want to learn about who they are, what they do, right, and how you are actually interconnected as an American resident, right?
Well, Eduardo, that's why the Smithsonian Latino Center exists, right? And essentially why you're working on this project to bring this museum. And in next year, right? It's 25 years for the Smithsonian Latino Center celebrating.
25 years. Yeah, there was a report in 1994 called Willful Neglect, and it was a very damning report that was commissioned by the Smithsonian itself, and you have to hand it to the institution for, doing it, right? Commissioning the report, which revealed that there was so little done. I mean, the name says it all, willful neglect. And so the Smithsonian said, well, that's not a good report. What are we going to do about it? And so the next year, and years following, 1997, a couple years after, 3 years after, the Latino Center was established. And our role really is to ensure Latino presence within the institution, which is a monumental task, because we're talking about 19 museums, soon to be 21 museums, 9 research centers, a national zoo, a major festival on the mall, a recording label, et cetera. So, that's a lot of territory to cover, a lot of content to explore, to research, to do exhibitions around, to collect about, to program educational and public programs, to publish and so forth, and to also use the digital world as a way to disseminate this information and this experience. The Smithsonian itself is 175 years old, and the mission remains the same after 175 years, and that's very simply an institution to increase and the increase in diffusion of knowledge. Pretty simple. And so, following up and executing that mission is our task. And so, this gallery that we're building at the National Museum of American History and the museum that will follow later are all about that: the increase and diffusion of knowledge, and examining the American experience through a Latino lens, right?
Yeah,
American
I have a
history.
question.
Go ahead.
But forgive me. No, I just like point of personal privilege. One of the things that I find you said, Latinos are diverse. We have so many different kinds of history. I'm Puerto Rican. You're Chicano. Like, how do you thread that all together into a museum and sort of weave through principal narratives? Like, I'm thinking the Museum of African American History and slavery sort of being this central theme, right? What's the central theme of the American Latino?
I think that's to be determined. I would say, just off the top of my head, it could be migration and immigration. It could be movement, right? That could shape it. Obviously slavery is a narrative, because who knows? I mean, given my background, my ethnic background, I could have come from enslaved people myself, right, in Mexico, right? But I'll just leave that to more research I have to do. But to your point, how do we include everyone's story? I'll tell you, this first exhibition that we're putting in the Molina Gallery is entitled Presente, a Latino History of the United States. And we take it all the way from indigenous periods all the way through to contemporary. And we highlight critical episodes like the one we were talking about earlier, the US-Mexico War. We also talk about another period which is near and dear to your heart, the Spanish-American War of 1898, and where the United States really exerts its imperial vision and assumes control over Puerto Rico. And of course, Puerto Rico continues to be possession of the United States. The liberation of Cuba. The Philippines were also taken as a sort of a prize as well in that war that was fought between Spain and the United States. So we take on major episodes. We look at the issue of immigration. One of the most exciting objects in the exhibition is a balsa, a Cuban raft, right? These are these ramshackle rafts that were put together with styrofoam and duct tape and God only knows what else, that Cuban refugees got in and quote unquote sailed to Florida and made it here. And so it's a very dramatic piece. It's very moving, because you understand in just that one object what these folks went through to leave what was an undesirable situation in Cuba and make their way to the United States. And so we're using objects and stories to really cover a broad swath of Latino history. Are we going to miss some chapters? Absolutely. There's just no way within 4,500 square feet. I mean, it's hard enough to do that in a big museum, right? Like you mentioned, African American history and culture. But can you imagine trying to do that in a 4,500 square foot space? Wow. But we're doing the best we can. Subsequent exhibitions, we're going to go into deeper dives and specific subject matter. Like the next exhibition will really look at Latino youth movements, right? The Chicano movement, the Young Lords, efforts in, let's say, Miami, for example, and their battle against English-only laws and things of that nature. So, and these subsequent exhibitions, and when the museum is open, we'll have an opportunity to do these really deeper dives into specific subject areas, which I think will be a welcome and fascinating process.
Well, so I'm actually very familiar with the Smithsonian Latino Center. I actually presented one of my research papers that I did for the U.S. Latino Studies class at the University of Maryland. And I know that part of how you're able to do your work is the pedagogy that's being built by ethnic studies programs across the country at a university level, right? But I'm curious about the K through 12 level. And, are the history of Latino communities, being taught in schools the way they should be? And why is that important?
Yeah, it's absolutely not. I mean, it goes back to this notion. If you actually knew about us, knew about what our histories are, knew about what contributions we've made to this country, knew a little bit about our contemporary life, you might actually like us. You might actually welcome us. You might actually, want to work with us and live among us and so forth, or live with us, if you will. And so, that starts early on within the educational system. I mean, we have a great education program at the Latino Center, great staff who are working with a program that is virtual, that supplies curriculum materials to teachers who teach even at the elementary grade school level, right? Because they're struggling for material and curriculum-based information to use with their students. For example, in Georgia, around the Atlanta area where you see this explosion, and the New South is the Latino New South is real, right? Charlotte, Atlanta, Memphis, I can go Birmingham, all of a sudden teachers are having seen this influx of Latino students, and they're looking for materials, teaching materials that they can use to engage these new students who are coming into their third, fourth, or fifth grade classrooms, and they're at a loss. So I think the Smithsonian, let's recognize that the Smithsonian is .edu. Now, we're not .com. Well, there's a .com, but that's the Smithsonian Magazine and some of our other commercial ventures. But it's basically a .edu. We're an educational institution, and we're in the nation's museum. So I think we have a responsibility to the educational sector, right? To provide information and materials that teachers can use, that parents can use to better educate today's youth.
So we're running out of time, Eduardo, and I didn't want to miss the opportunity to ask you this question. Some of my friends call this Hispanic Heritage Month, right? And disparage, what this time is supposed to be. But I wonder, how can this month be a time to reflect on the contributions of Latinos, sort of beyond the scripted platitudes, and how can we sustain that throughout the entire year? Because I think we're pretty awesome outside of September and October.
Sometimes I call it Hispanic Hysteria Month. It's honestly, sometimes it's almost the bane of my existence. But because I say, like, people will say, well, hey, Eduardo, what's the Latino Center doing for Hispanic Heritage Month? And I say, buddy, every month is Hispanic Heritage Month for me. So I think, that's the kind of way I see it. We have to make Hispanic Heritage Month a 12-month proposition rather than a 1-month proposition. Again, we are foundational. Our role is foundational in this country. It has been for a long, long time. It is today and it will be tomorrow. And there's so much more that we need to learn, even about our own selves, right? I'm a Chicano. I know a lot about Puerto Rican history or Cuban history or the Cuban community or the Dominican community, Central America. I live in a Central American dominated neighborhood here in Washington, D.C. and Columbia Heights. So I've come to learn, and I'm always open. So I think this is, to learning more. And so I think it's a lifelong proposition, and we should always be celebrating Latino contributions to our country's history and culture on a daily basis. And we should all be wanting to learn more, befriend Latinos and Latinas to learn about their lives and their struggles and their triumphs and their accomplishments. And so I think that makes for a better societal fabric, now and in the future. And I'd like to think that the Smithsonian can play a big role in that respect.
Well, so we're running out of time, and I wanted to ask you one question, because we came up on the issues or the notion of worthiness and acceptance. Is having a Latino museum about us being accepted into the majority culture, or what is it? What is it?
I think so. I read an interesting book by Arlene Davila, who's a scholar at NYU, New York University, who did a chapter in a book called oh my gosh, I forgot the name of the book. Oh, it's Culture Works, I think it is. And in one of the chapters, she takes on the notion at that time, very nascent, the establishment of the National Museum of the American Latino. A commission had just been established in, I want to say 2008, 2009. And she boiled it down very succinctly, which is, this is really about the politics of value and worth, right? And so, will the U.S. Congress eventually view the Latino community as being valuable enough, as being worthy enough to have its own museum, right? To have our own museum. And as you know, Congress, as was pointed out in the intro to this program, did pass a bill in December of last year, 2020, to establish the National Museum of the American Latino. So I guess one could say Congress finally realized that the Latino community was worthy enough and valuable enough to move this project forward. I would like to think that attitude still persists, and Congress is still on the hook for some of the money to support the planning, design, and construction of this new museum. So if they do that, or when they do that, Congress acts in that regard to appropriate their 50-50, their 50% of the deal, we'll know whether or not we are worthy enough and valuable enough to be able to sustain this great enterprise. I think the answer will be yes.
Well, thank you for that. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. Thank you, Eduardo Díaz, for speaking with me today.
It's a pleasure to be
And
with
thanks.
you. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. On Friday, October 1st at 11:30 a.m., join my colleague Mariana Sotomayor for her conversation with Texas Congresswoman Veronica Escobar as part of our continuing conversations marking Hispanic Heritage Month. Go to WashingtonPost.live.com to register for upcoming programs. I'm Arelis Hernández, and thank you for taking your time and watching Washington Post Live.